Our second speaker this morning is Rasmus Nielsen. Rasmus is a senior research fellow at Green Templeton College, and he's director of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. He is a professor of political communication here at the university, and his talk is entitled, "What's Happening to Our Media? What You Need to Know." So over to you, Rasmus.
Thank you very much, Michael. I mean, I suppose in some ways this is quite appropriate to move from climate change to a structural transformation in what I like to think of as our media environment. Before I run through 5 things that I think everybody needs to know about the future of news and journalism and its role in our societies, I just want to briefly say a few things about the Reuters Institute and our connection with the college. So the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism is part of the Department of Politics and International Relations, and we have been a part of Green Templeton College since the college emerged from the merger, and before that the Reuters Fellowship Program was part of Green College for more than 30 years. The mission of the Reuters Institute is to explore the future of journalism worldwide and to connect practice and research on issues that matter for journalists, but also for the public and others who are interested in understanding the role that journalism and news play in our societies. We do that through a fellowship program for mid-career journalists who come to Oxford from all over the world to join the Institute for 3 to 6 months normally, and while they are with us in Oxford, are also part of the college community, and many of you will have met them and seen them at college lunches and college seminars and various college events as well, and many of you probably talk to them about their work and about your work. We also run leadership development programs for editors and executives in the news industry, trying to help them work through the challenges that they face, the opportunities they have, and how they might respond to those. And then finally, we do research, where we try to bring the standards of rigorous social science to bear on some of the big issues facing journalism and news media around the world, and publish both through peer-reviewed academic outlets, but also try to ensure that we produce a sort of a steady stream of more accessible and perhaps sometimes a bit more timely pieces of analysis that help the profession and the industry think about its role in society and how it's changing. And what I wanted to do today is to highlight some of the sort of the key features of this structural transformation in our media environment. I'm going to share my slides here, so we can go through these. Before I dive into going through the 5 things, I want to sort of preface this by saying that I understand that the sort of personal experience of dealing with the news is often frustrating. News, like everything else, is imperfect. It's fallen short in many ways, in the coverage of the climate emergency being one notable example of it. But I think it's also important to sort of remember that journalism, with its many imperfections, is very important. And we have very strong research, not just after dinner speeches by retired editors and other sort of people with a sort of sentimental tear in their eyes praising their former vocation for its great role in democracy and whatnot. We have very solid research documenting how independent, professional news from journalists help people understand society better, help them be more engaged in the political process, help them feel more connected with their communities, and also, even when people are perhaps not always paying much attention, help hold power to account by reducing corruption in the public sector and increasing the chance that elected representatives vote in accordance with the priorities and values of the people that they represent in their constituency. So there are many imperfections with journalism that we are keenly aware of, and journalists too are, but also many reasons to recognize its real societal importance. I also want to say that the 5 things I'm going to focus on here are sort of big global trends, but of course there are variations from country to country. And in particular, one aspect I won't talk about here is the war on journalism that's being waged by authoritarian leaders and other powerful individuals around the world who are actively using every means at their disposal to try to silence independent reporters and independent news media and crack down on free expression, including free journalism, which is a very pronounced feature of our times and has been for decades by now in the sort of democratic recession that political scientists and others speak about. So with those preliminaries, if you will. What are the 5 things that I think everybody needs to know about the future of journalism? This is based on a piece of work that Mira Selva, the director of the Journalist Fellowship Program at the Institute, and myself did last year, where we were invited to go to the World Economic Forum in Davos to try to help the people who gather there think about the way in which journalism is changing around the world. And these are the 5 things we pulled out. The first observation we would make is that we have moved from a world where media organizations were the gatekeepers to a world where media are still the organizations that create the news agenda, in the sense that only the things that journalists report constitute what we think of as news. But platform companies such as Google and Facebook increasingly control access to audiences. This is a very fundamental change, and I'll just illustrate it with one slide. When we ask in our annual digital news report survey of all the different ways in which people find news online, what is the main way in which they access news? We find that only about 1/3 of our respondents globally say that going direct to a news site or app is their main way of getting news online, and a majority rely on various forms of site door access, most importantly search engines, effectively Google, secondly social media. Several of these platforms are owned by one company, Facebook, and to some extent aggregators, again often associated with these large technology companies. Now this is a very fundamental change from a situation not so long ago where news was primarily discovered by going directly to news providers. You bought a print newspaper, you turned on a broadcast device to watch a channel or listen to a channel. And in that situation, the media organizations controlled both the content and the channels, where increasingly in an online environment, while direct is still important, in particular for an upmarket elite audience of news lovers, for the wider public, a lot of news is discovered through various platform intermediaries who control access to the audience. This is a very fundamental change in how news is accessed and consumed in our societies. The second observation I wanted to make is that this move to a more digital, mobile, and platform-dominated media environment generally does not generate filter bubbles. Instead, we find that social media and search engines drive people to more and more diverse sources of information. I think many of you will have come across this notion of filter bubbles. It's very, very prominent in elite discussions and in sort of public conversations among pundits and policymakers, and it sort of appears all the time in policy documents and speeches and the like, and commentary of various sorts. There is a really, really pronounced disconnect here between the way in which an elite and sort of commentators and pundits of various sorts talk about the media environment and what actual evidence-based independent research has actually found. The idea of filter bubbles is very simple. It is that the business models of large platforms is based on personalization, and you can imagine a world in which they have economic incentives to feed everybody less and less diverse content, simply things that confirm and reinforce their pre-existing worldviews. Now, in fact, when we look more closely, and I will show just the simplest illustration of this, at the difference between the news users who do not use social media for news and those who do, the news users who do not use search engines for news and those who do, what we find in country after country is that people who use these platforms, with all their many imperfections and the various problems associated with their business models and their market power, are in almost every instance use significantly more and significantly more diverse different sources of news. And I think it's really, really important to understand why this is so. It is that many of the people who are on a call like this may be sort of using 5 or 6 different sources of news every week that they seek out of their own volition by going direct to the news site or app of a provider. But most people don't. Most people on a routine basis use very few different sources of news, 2 or 3. And you can, I think, immediately see, if you think about the way in which platform companies operate and their business incentives, that there is almost no way in which a search engine or a social media platform would only feed people more of the same 2 or 3 sources that they already seek out of their own volition. There will almost always be more, and in fact we find this in study after study at the Reuters Institute, but also many other places, and there seems to be a complete disconnect on this issue, where it's treated as an article of faith and treated as if it's fact by many elites that there are these filter bubbles, when in fact there is almost no research that find these things. In fact, the research generally points in the opposite direction and suggests that incidental exposure and automated serendipity in these systems drive people to more and more diverse news than what they seek out on their own. Now, one reason that's important is the third thing that I want to highlight, which is that journalism is often losing the battle for people's attention, and in some, but not all countries, also for the public's trust. And this is really increasing information inequality in our societies. I'll show just a sort of a simple illustration of this from our research, where we categorize survey respondents into news lovers who are extremely interested in news and access news more than 5 times a day. This is probably largely people like the people in this call. Daily briefers, who are people who say they are at least somewhat interested in news and access news at least once a day. And then casual users, who typically are not very or not at all interested in news and typically access news less than once a day. And I think, first of all, it's just really important to recognize that while you and all your friends may be news lovers who use the news all the time and probably know now that Trump apparently is tested positive for coronavirus, you are unusual. You are very unusual, in fact. And there are many people who will only learn this tonight when they watch TV, or with a quick flick on their smartphone in the evening, and some people who won't learn till tomorrow, perhaps, or later in the week, because they don't actually consume any news on a routine basis. Now, this is driven in part by choice, with different interests and a great proliferation of choice and different options available. People who are less interested in news, more interested in other things, have more things to choose from. And we see this sort of polarization with a very pronounced social inequality, where the people who consume less news also tend to be lower income, lower levels of formal education, and often from various marginalized communities. They're also often women. And the reason I think it's important to recognize the way in which platforms in fact drive more diverse and more news use is it's one of the few factors that point in the opposite direction of information inequality, and it's one of the few forces right now that somewhat reduce the self-selection that drives us towards greater and greater information inequality between news lovers at one end and then the casual users or even news avoiders at the other end. The fourth thing I want to highlight here is that it's clear that while the platforms are changing news discovery, and as said, have very different impacts on news use than is often assumed by people with many opinions and few facts, it's also clear that their rise has very fundamentally challenged the business models that historically funded professional journalism, and that this disruption of the old business of news is leaving news media more vulnerable to both commercial pressures but also to political pressures of various sorts. Just a simple illustration of this is the development in the global advertising market. Globally, advertising increasingly is following audiences online. As we go online, advertisers want to reach us also go online. And in the online environment, markets are no longer really defined by geography. They were historically, and not really defined by individual brands or websites, but much more organized around the platforms. And just 2 companies, Google and Facebook, now account for at least about half of all digital advertising globally. Now, this is great for their shareholders, and it allows these for-profit companies to provide all the different services that most of us use many times a day, because they're very convenient, very compelling, and very useful, and very engaging. But it has direct sort of collateral damage in the news industry, which historically was heavily reliant on advertising revenues that no longer go to news, because advertisers were never interested in news. They were interested in audiences, and as those audiences go elsewhere, increasingly to Google and Facebook and a few other large platforms, the advertisers follow them, and the news business is disrupted with very direct consequences for employment in newsrooms across the world. The final thing I want to say is that while this is a very challenging environment in many ways, for the news industry in particular, but also for our societies in a range of ways, I really think we should recognize that news is more diverse than ever in many ways. And while there is a lot of sort of journalism, as it's often put in the UK, sort of quick rewrites of press releases and pretty superficial rewrites of competitors' content, in my personal opinion, the best journalism today is in many cases better than ever. And it's taking on, even if it's somewhat diminished in terms of its resources, taking on everyone from the most powerful politicians to the biggest private companies. And I think we should really recognize this as an example of how a profession is reinventing itself, not always sort of happily and voluntarily, if you will, but often with sort of a vanguard of people who are really committed to renewing the professional mission of journalism and the businesses that sustain it, and do it in really interesting and impressive ways. I'm showing just a few examples here of everything from Deutschland spricht, a program launched by Zeit Online in Germany, later went across Europe, of matching up readers with opposite political opinions for one-on-one conversations. We see amazing collaborations around fact-checking and verification, like the cross-check collaboration orchestrated by First Draft, a nonprofit. And of course, we see amazing investigative journalism, often collaborative in a profession that historically was almost pathologically competitive, where lots of different news organizations come together, share sources, and drive these global investigations that have been sort of illustrated by the Panama Papers investigation, for example. And I think in that sense, we are in a world where moving forward, independent professional journalism will be more important in a way than ever in helping people understand the major challenges and opportunities that face us around the world, from everything from day-to-day local events to global issues. But at the same time, we also see that the business of news is changing and journalism is at risk of becoming less robust and ultimately, in worst case scenario, incapable of helping the public make sense of our times and holding power to account. And what we try to do at the Reuters Institute really is to work through these challenges with journalists and news leaders, give them evidence, introduce them to interesting people, and create a safe space where they can talk through these really difficult and challenging things and think about how they, in their own professional practice, want to do things, sometimes the same way as they've done in the past, but also very often differently, to try to renew the purpose of journalism, but also the different institutions that sustain it and enable it to play the role that it's played in our societies historically.
Great, Rasmus. Thank you very much for that. We've got one here from Dario Moreira. Dario says, I was fascinated by your debunking filter bubbles. I'm wondering whether it applies to more informal news sources such as YouTube, where independent, non-peer-reviewed media reports on events. Does the data showing the absence of filter bubbles consider infotainment sources such as YouTube, or only journalistic outlets?
Thanks. I think that's a great question. The findings apply to YouTube as well, where it's true that the vast majority of the use of YouTube, as with other platforms, are either entertainment or utilitarian, that sort of people have things they need to get on with things, or they want to be diverted. And these are the main motivations often for using the large platforms. But even as they do that, they also are exposed to news in the process as part of the larger package. Now, as you say, some of that comes from alternative sources that are not professional reporters at established news organizations, but some of it does come from news organizations, and people end up watching news that they wouldn't have seen otherwise. And in that sense, the filter bubble phenomenon, as said, is sort of overwhelmingly challenged by actual research, which finds the opposite. Now, I want to stress that there are two other very real problems that people, I think, are sometimes conflating with the filter bubble phenomenon. One is the social inequality that I mentioned. There is if you will, a real filter bubble, a real sort of difference between an elite that follows the news a lot and then a growing minority of people who really don't. So social inequality is very pronounced. The other is the idea of echo chambers, the question of whether some people live in with sort of a media diet that only reflects and reinforces their pre-existing views. This does happen. I think that's important to recognize. There are people who live in echo chambers. Arguably, perhaps the biggest echo chamber is sort of or not the biggest, but the most consequential echo chamber may well be the elite, if you will, that is sort of fairly self-referential and a little bit out of touch with many other people, I would dare to suggest. But there are echo chambers. Only what's important is to recognize it's overwhelmingly driven by people's choices, by people's active decisions to seek out sources of news that may confirm with their pre-existing views and values. It's very rarely, if at all, driven by algorithms who actually help companies make money by doing the opposite, by exposing people to more and more diverse things.
So Dario follows up by saying, are there any alternative business models for journalism which could reduce its reliance on advertising revenue?
I mean, we're seeing a very big push right now in the direction of reader revenues. I think many of you will have sort of come across this in your browsing on the internet, that many news outlets that not so long ago were free at the point of consumption, supported by advertising, are now asking you to register or sign up or offering you subscriptions and not giving you free and unfettered access to all their online news. So there's a big push in direction of reader revenues. It's a winner takes most market. I think a number of titles will succeed, and we are seeing this around the world, as the New York Times is the most prominent example, but it's far from alone. Often sort of upmarket national newspapers are sort of cornering the market and entering what Louis Dreyfus, the CEO of Le Monde in France, calls a virtuous circle, where by doing great journalism that appeals to affluent elite audiences, you recruit more subscribers that help you make more money, that in turn allow you to invest in more great journalism, further putting you ahead of your direct competitors. So we're seeing quite a lot of success in that space, though I would stress it's a winner takes most market and it won't work for every news outlets. We're also seeing, I would say, sort of increased interest in very different models of sort of non-profit journalism, where the focus isn't on creating a large and lucrative private company, for-profit company, but just securing the basic resources that enable independent journalists to do really important work and operate more like a non-profit or an NGO than as a sort of a large corporate. And finally, I think we are also seeing important examples of news organizations who are essentially trying to make their money in all sorts of other areas, events and the like, and where the journalism isn't really the main way that they make money. It's more the way that they establish their position in society, show the value of what they do, and then they try to generate income around hosting events, providing consultancy services, or doing similar things off the back of the position that the news gives them in society. So I'm a cautious optimist about the future of journalism. I think a lot of the old business models are in inexorable decline. People are never going to return to print newspapers or live scheduled linear television. Certainly not people under 40. But that doesn't mean that there are no models for the future. They won't work for everyone, but they will work for some, and those organizations will do great journalism, I think.
One from me. How do you think people's discernment about the validity of content has changed as this model for discovering news has changed over the last 25 years or so? My perception is that some younger people are a lot less discerning about the content and its veracity than perhaps I remember being as a younger person. What's your view on that?
I think the what you describe, I think, is sort of a common conception. I would say that the evidence would actually sort of suggest that the situation is somewhat different from that. I think the first observation to make is that much of the public navigate information overall on the basis of what we in our research has described as generalized skepticism. And the problem in a way often is not that people are too credulous, but almost the opposite. They're almost sort of paralyzed by something that risks danger, sort of bordering on cynicism, if you will. And in that sense, I think it's just really, really important to remember whenever we sort of hear these discussions of misinformation and the like, that there are very few people left in the world who believe things naively when they come across them. Most people, in fact, take the opposite stance and are extremely skeptical of everything. The second observation would be that when we then look at what sources people do in fact trust, there are very, very meaningful differences, even in countries where overall trust in news might be quite low, as it is in the UK. There are a number of individual brands that are very highly and very broadly trusted across the political spectrum and across many different sort of social divides in our society, the BBC being the most prominent example, but also often upmarket newspapers, the Financial Times, to some extent the Guardian and the Times, and local media are often also highly trusted. So individual brands are often highly trusted by many different people, even in low trust contexts. And finally, I would say that while I think there is some truth to the idea that many young people are relying less on established news media and more on alternative sources of information online, and some of these alternative sources report news or produce information in very different ways, in ways that may not sort of inspire the same confidence in me as professional journalism does, and I may have reservations about some of it. I would sort of qualify that observation with two things. The first is, I think that's actually quite a reasonable approach, given how contemptuous many news media seem to be of the values and experiences of younger people. Whether we think about the big value divides in our society over climate change, over issues of, say, transsexual rights, or issues of sort of reckoning with racism, for example, where I think it's just clear that there are a number of news organizations in this country, at least, that are just actively hostile to the sort of the values that are held by many young people, and I can't really see why one would expect young people to do anything but turn their back on those brands. And in fact, we do find that trust in some of the right-wing newspapers in the UK is much lower amongst young people than amongst older people. And secondly, in terms of how people navigate things online, we don't have similar research in the UK, but research in the US suggests that actually the majority of sort of demonstrably fake news that's consumed on the internet is consumed by a very small number of very conservative, very old white men, who are both highly partisan supporters of Mr. Trump and a certain sort of strand within the Republican Party, but are also have, for lack of a better word, very limited media literacy, digital media literacy specifically. And as sort of the joke goes in the technology industry, the problem with old people is that they click on things. And actually, in that sense, the consumption of misinformation, at least in the US, is actually quite concentrated amongst older right-wing men, rather than amongst younger people, who I think sometimes are thought to be more vulnerable to these things, but in fact may be more literate and more able to navigate these environments than some of their older fellow citizens.
Okay, I've got a follow-up to that, and then another question from Dario Moreira, but this is from Paddy Coulter, saying, following on from your last comments, can you say something more about impartiality as a journalism standard?
Thanks, Paddy. Good to hear you indirectly. I mean, it's interesting. I think on the one hand, what we see in the UK and also in other countries around the world is that in societies that are very diverse and where people have very different opinions on things that matter greatly and sometimes disagree very vigorously about at least some of these issues, as we see around Brexit, as we see around how the government is handling the coronavirus crisis, and as I mentioned, as we see, I think, across generations on issues like climate change and some other issues. You know, as these disagreements become more sort of visible and explicit and sort of intense, it becomes harder and harder to be recognized as being duly impartial. It is simply easier to seem impartial if there is limited disagreement amongst a set number of actors on a set number of issues. In more controversial times, much harder. And I think the BBC and many others are facing that challenge and dealing with it in ways that, as our research suggests, still means that most people trust them. But it does make their job much harder, and trust is eroding also in flagship brands like the BBC. The second question, I think, then is do people actually want impartiality? And I think there is a conception amongst some that that people are sort of highly politicized in their news use and just sort of seek out things that confirm their opinion and want journalists to sort of be crusaders that sort of fight for a cause or sort of preach their corner. And it's true that there is a minority of people who think like this, but when we ask in our survey whether people on balance would prefer news outlets that share their point of view, challenge their point of view, or express no particular point of view, an overwhelming majority in the UK, from memory about 80%, say they prefer news sources that express no particular point of view. And I think this is a very forceful reminder that while politics is quite central to how a very sort of active and vocal minority live their lives, express themselves in public, and often sort of dominate self-referential elite discussions and journalistic discussions around news, its role in society, and its future, they are highly unusual and often quite extreme outliers, and frankly often have little, if any, insight into what sort of the rest of the population really cares about. And it's very clear that there are many people in the UK who don't want to be preached to, whether by people who they agree with or disagree with, and essentially want sort of a fairly minimalistic and straight news reporting so they can get on with their lives rather than listen to lectures all the time.
Okay, look, my challenge this morning is to keep us to time. This is a fascinating discussion, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to pass on Dario's final question.